All right, so this is the second of the presentations of the information we shared with you back in September. And I wanted to share it with you again just so it's fresh in your mind as you're thinking about the 21st and planning and designing for the asynchronous element, but also potentially the synchronous element of that fully online classroom where during the day you may say, I'm going to focus in on reading, I'm going to focus in on phonics or phonemic awareness. Well, great. So you're going to create some lessons there, realizing that for a group of 20 students, you're going to have a portion of those students synchronously with you, and then the rest of the students, what will they be doing? And so, how are you planning to not only communicate with, engage, facilitate, have them interact with you, have them work with their child when they're asynchronous, and the list goes on with that adult in the home? And the adult could be mom, dad, stepmom, stepdad, grandma, grandpa, uncle, aunt. Most likely, it's not going to be an older sibling. Particularly in this environment, think about it this way. If they've gone fully online, let's go with one of these parameters, they have to, if they've gone fully online at the elementary level, parents have signed a contract to say that they will actually be there while that child is in their fully online experience. So yes, that means that mom and dad or grandma and grandpa are working remotely. Maybe they're retired. Maybe one of them is not working. Maybe they've had to take a time off, whatever it may be. But let's just plan the idea that an adult is in the home during the asynchronous time, because we don't want a third grader by themselves during the school day. And of course, for us to be able to facilitate what we want them to do, research shows that evidence shows schools that do virtual online learning show that they need an adult in the home for lots of different reasons. I'm just simply it's not simply to make sure they do their work. It's so much more. So with that thought in mind, that was something we put up there in terms of collaboration ideas. But with that thought in mind, I think what we need to start thinking about are the digital tools and strategies. And these are equal, maybe even strategies more so than digital tools, that we can use effectively to communicate and then collaborate with the adult in the home. And that adult in the home, I'm going to simply call a learning coach. And we're going to get to that. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I'm going to call a learning coach right from the get-go. All right, so with that said, there is a number of different tips and tools. And by the way, I'm going to give you some resources specifically with Learning Coach, but let's go ahead and define that. Schools prior to the pandemic that were facilitating fully online instruction. In the state of Kansas, we were talking tens of thousands of students. In Lawrence, we were talking over 1,000 students. Across the country, we're talking millions. In the states of Florida and Michigan, they were required to do a fully online semester, a class during the semester before they graduated. It was something that they thought was a tool for the future. Now, yes, it was at the high school level, so a bit different from what we're talking about. But anyways, the adult in the home in these fully online schools prior to the pandemic were called a learning coach. And they were called a learning coach very specifically because what they were seeing is if the child's going to be successful, they need an adult in the home to coach them, to facilitate, to prompt, to instruct, to do a variety of different things that oftentimes we'll use aids. We as teachers will facilitate in the face-to-face or brick and mortar type of instruction. So this learning coach has been something right from the get-go. And what do? Do a variety of things. Oftentimes, learning coaches will facilitate instruction. They will create some materials. They'll download the materials and make sure the student is using them. They'll help facilitate aspects of curriculum and content. They'll also be an aid. They'll be a facilitator. They'll be the tutor. They'll be the person there prompting them, reminding them, making sure they stay on task. And also, they're the parent. So as they normally would be a child, they may read to them as we would for homework. They may review the homework. They may review the directions. Everything a parent traditionally is asked to do from a school perspective at the elementary level. And I can tell you, in the brick and mortar, today, face-to-face, there's a list of things that we ask of parents. Not only do we ask them to bring materials into school, we ask them to have the materials at home, and there's a list of things we ask them to do, if not daily, 2 or 3 times a week in the evenings with their children. So go online, of course, we're going to have that list, and it's going to be triple, quadruple, whatever. So parents, when they've been researched, and I've collected some of this data over the years with colleagues, they have shared that they are the eyes and ears. They've described, we are the eyes and ears of the educator. We're the one that can tell the educator what's happening in the challenge for the asynchronous. We're the ones that can tell us where the student is being, a barrier, where they're struggling. We can tell the parent where they're having success in the asynchronous or even in the synchronous. They're working with 5 or 6 and one student's off, off task and disengaged, mom or dad or aunt, uncle, or grandma, grandpa, the learning coach, they're there. They're watching that. They're seeing what's happening. Maybe it's the pet that comes in that's distracting. Maybe it's something on in the next room that's distracting. They can start problem solving by sharing with the teacher what they're seeing and have the educator problem solve with them. So there's a lot of different things that the family member in the home, the learning coach in the home, can facilitate and communicate with the educator. Now, the role of the learning coach is identified by a number of different resources. I've given you one to hyperlink to that will walk you through all sorts of different roles that the learning coach takes. So one is they're a communicator. They'll email, they'll read the announcements, they'll return phone calls, they'll video conference to problem solve, to understand what is taking place, to help understand a strategy, to understand what they need to model. A host of things goes on about what they are supposed to do, and communication is a key component. Now, brick and mortar, we may communicate every 9-10 months. We may not hear from the parent, maybe one-way communication. We as the educator will send home a weekly newsletter. We'll send home emails. We may not hear anything from the parent until that parent conference. And for some of our learners, we may not even see them at the parent conference. That doesn't happen in the fully online because of what we're dependent upon them in the synchronous and asynchronous environment. We are expecting them, by the way, to be the organizer. They need to make sure that they've organized a good organized learning environment. They need to make sure that they're facilitating that. We do that at school. We're organizing our classroom constantly to make sure it's appropriate for our learners. Well, the expectation is they're doing the same. They're not using the bedroom and a bed as the primary place they're spending the entire day. It's not particularly conducive. But maybe the bedroom's the only spot, but maybe now they're bringing in a chair and a desk. Or maybe they're reconverting that bed for another different way for them to be able to operate as a place to sit and operate and interact, and not just simply sleep and hang out and do whatever you do for recreation on that bed in terms of watching videos and things of that nature. So they're the chief organizer. They're the master scheduler as well. Yes, we as a teacher will organize things, but there's a bunch of asynchronous you're going to ask them to do. Well, then we as the parent will need to, the learning coach, we'll need to make sure we facilitate that. There's a structure for the day we'll need to make sure. When you're getting online, you need to be online at 10:15 a.m. because that's when Ms. Fine is going to be online. I better make sure that you're online then. I better make sure you're prepared for that. Things of that nature. So I'm the one facilitating that. Now I'm doing that with the help of the teacher. The teacher might be the one that's scheduling it, but I'm the one then fulfilling that schedule with the child. I'm also, well, in some instances, in the state of Kansas previously, I had to be the attendance person. We'll skip over that. There's a list of other things for us to consider when we're planning for that November 21st lesson, when we're lessons actually. So that's the assignment, right? We're planning for that synchronous and asynchronous. How are we engaging? How are we planning for the learning coach? I actually have it under I was about to say default, the template I created. What is the teacher doing? What's the learning coach doing? It's in the first column. And then it's asking what the student is doing. And then the third column talks about the teacher narrative. So with that, they're also facilitating comprehension. They're also monitoring comprehension. They're monitoring the connections. Maybe they're listening to Ms. Fine read some reading for that phonemic awareness. But in the process, maybe they're seeing the fact that their child is being caught with this type of word, or maybe they're not connecting with the vocabulary being shown, or maybe not pronouncing the way it's supposed to be pronounced, and they're hearing that, and it's on mute, and Ms. Fine's not hearing that. So in the process, we need to, as the learning coach, communicate, facilitate, understand. There may be strategies that Ms. Fine introduces that she wants us to mimic in the asynchronous or the after school, the homework type of experience. What are they? How do we understand them? Et cetera, et cetera. We also may be the one monitoring. We may be asked to check in. We may be asked to facilitate the exit slip as the learning coach and then report back to Ms. Fine on the learning management system what we did or what we did not do. There's also ways that we could assist with the lessons. So for example, one lesson that's asynchronous, it starts off synchronous. Now go do the following. Make sure you printed out this material that I have in my learning management system and actively complete the following. The learning coach would facilitate with that. I just mentioned in terms of monitoring for comprehension of the vocabulary, the different words with my example with Ms. Fine. It could be the implementation of the lesson. Again, that could be synchronous where the lesson's being asked to do the following and I'm here kind of as an aid would with a student that struggles, being able to do that while the teacher's kind of facilitating that overall instruction, but also equally important, the asynchronous, when they're off independently, what's expected of them when they're signing on. And by the way, they're not all just simply going to sit on the computer the entire day. They're going to do some lessons asynchronously, let's say through IXL, but there'll be other things that they'll be expected to do independently off the computer. And that's where it may be materials we need, it may be prompting we may need, it may be tutoring, it may be reading things out loud. That's where the coach would need to be facilitated. And that's where we as the educator need to facilitate and coach the coach. And a host of other things. Now, in addition, for example, K-12 online learning in 2019, in this instance, there's a lot of expectations, as I mentioned before to you, of the learning coach. And by the way, in terms of time, in terms of average, we're talking hundreds of minutes. We're talking several hours. So we're talking about in the K-5 environment, the learning coach was saying they were engaged 5 hours a day, 5 hours. Middle school is about 4 hours a day. The learning coach was reporting prior to the pandemic, 5 hours a day they were spending with their child involved with their education. 5 hours a day. That's a lot of time. Middle school 4, at the secondary level it was less. But that's time during the asynchronous, that's time prepping for the synchronous, and of course that's time that would be traditionally seen as homework, when most of us in the brick and mortar, we still go read to your child for 30 minutes of part of the day. Fine, we're going to add that into the 5 hours. All right, so that's more of a question there. So when we're thinking about the learning coach and we're thinking about the online lessons, thinking about the directions we're going to provide, think about the expectations, think about what we'll facilitate and what we're going to put down in the template that I created and what you're going to put down for the learning coach. Be considering about what you're going to ask them to do. How are you going to organize things? How are you going to empower them as tutors? Maybe it's the fact that now the students will go off and practice the following. I've created some directions for the learning coach to practice the following. I've created this guide to do the following. They download it, and then they do the following activity. So there's a number of different things that they'll need to facilitate as the educator to the learning coach to the educator. I want some of that in your online lesson, including how you're going to communicate. All right. In addition, of course, what digital tools will you be able to utilize and facilitate with that? So you might talk about how you're going to organize things in the learning management system. You don't need to draw all that out, but you'll talk about how you'll utilize the learning management system. Maybe you'll use an app called Reminder or something like that, where you'll put directions up. Whatever it may be, you're planning and designing, and you're sharing that with me as your role, but also the learning coach role in the process of this. Now, I could go on and on and on, but that's a big focus for the 21st. And I want to reinforce that. And if you want to stop right now and move on, that's fine. I will now, in subsequent components here, just kind of reinforce some of the things we talked about face-to-face that we could then think about from a design perspective when we're doing fully online or when we're doing some level of remote for the educator, or even hybrid for the educator. So first of all, there's a lot of resources out there, and I'm just simply scrolling down there, a bunch of different resources to facilitate family, school-family interaction, particularly for that remote, okay? For example, a lot of IEPs now went remote and are continuing remote. And oh my goodness, are there not a lot of tip sheets out there? There are. There are not a lot of resources out there to facilitate online IEPs? There are. And so, for example, everything from how are you going to use your LMS? Next, how are you going to use your Zoom or your WebEx or your Meet or whatever you're going to use, Teams? How are you going to coordinate calendars in using your LMS? What type of digital agenda are you going to provide? Because remember, you're going to be entirely remote. The beauty of entirely remote is mom and dad now can be at work and take a lunch break, not have to get into the car. They get on Zoom. Maybe they're in the middle of a meeting. They stop the meeting, they get on Zoom, they do the IP meeting, then they're back to work. So folks like this is going to be awesome for them for that flexibility. Now, we may still do face-to-face, but these are other options. And then also from a tool perspective, how are you as an educator going to maximize that Zoom? Are you going to record aspects of it? Are you going to use the chat? Are you going to use aspects where people can share their screen? Who's going to share their screen? What are you going to share? Things of that nature. So then there's lots of other things you can think about with the IP process outside the box. And one of them I'm going to share is the fact that not only are there tips for the technology, but also differing the model. So for example, the MAP process, which I talk about in my introductory class back in 326, those that had me know what I'm talking about. Those that did not have me may not have been introduced to it, but it's a whole different way of thinking about how to schedule and organize and facilitate an IP meeting. And so the map itself has step-by-step directions. Here's a template that you would complete together. I have a video that walks you through it. There's a host of other things for consideration for the MAP process. But maybe now that I'm doing it virtually, I can utilize different strategies. I can alter the way we interact because we have maybe a little more time, definitely more engagement because, of course, everyone will be there because that speech and language pathologist that misses a meeting because they're in another building now can just sign on, be able to do that and go back to their therapy when necessary. So lots of different strategies there. So big thing in terms of tools, though, and a lot of what I've already described is instructional video on our end, as well as what the learning coach might use is going to be critical. And we've talked about instructional video. I've got a bunch of different resources out here for you to think about. Now, this is above and beyond the 21st, but if you think about it, if I'm going to model, if I'm going to organize, if I'm going to share a strategy, if I'm going to describe directions, why would I not create an instructional video and walk you through it with visuals, with the narration, with the steps that you could watch time again? Me being the student or the learning coach to be able to facilitate it. And there's lots of different examples of how educators have done it. Here's one in terms of the educator shares about subtracting mixed numbers. Well, the beautiful thing about it is she's modeling it for the child, but she's also modeling it for the parent for them to practice with their child. So a rinse and repeat, okay? There's also, of course, lots of different ways to empower them, as I mentioned, with the learning coach. But there's ways, for example, to introduce strategy instruction. So let's say we're trying to teach a writing strategy for his child. And we're trying to do it, of course, remotely, or even if we're trying to teach it face-to-face. Why wouldn't we want to make sure the parent understands what that learning strategy is all about? So why wouldn't we share with them resources like pre-made videos about what the strategy looks like, how it works, what the steps are? So mom and dad, grandma and grandpa, they can get an understanding of what the child's trying to mimic, and you can then help facilitate and support them in the process. Lots of different ways. And of course, there's so many different ways of capturing your own screen. I'm using Camtasia for this video, but there's Screencastify, there's steps to use Screencastify. Of course, there's ways to monitor via that. There's videos on how to make effective videos for learning. There's countless different things to be able to do that. How to edit to make certain you write video. Many of you guys are using Canva, but to me, the more you want to do with the video, the more you may want to edit, the more you may want to modify, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there's lots of different free tools to do it, to be able to capture, edit, everything in between. And these are all different resources. Now, these are resources in terms of communication. These are resources for both podcasts as well as video casts. And of course, it goes on and on and on. And let me go ahead and give you a few more resources. These are ways for communication, popular communication apps that go between school, home, and home school. These are podcasts teachers can utilize to better understand how to use audio and video in some of their instructional parts. These are ways teachers are using tools to communicate with home and home to communicate with school, and the list goes on. So I did a lot of blah out there, but the big thing I wanted to reinforce from the get-go, if you're still with me, is for the 21st, we need to think about how we're empowering that learning coach, how we're facilitating that learning coach, how we're utilizing the tools that we have available to help them further be a learning coach at home, everything in between. All right, so hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully that was a good review for the 21st. And again, our expectation is not only are you telling me what the teacher's doing, but then you're telling me how you're empowering and what the learning coaches will be facilitating things, particularly in the asynchronous part of the instruction that you're planning. Hope this was helpful.